Thanks for joining. I am Holly Conrad Smith. If we haven't met, I am leading up customer success at Giraffe. And I'm really excited to share Lens with you all today. The first thing to know is this webinar is intended to be interactive. So please feel free to unmute and ask questions. If you don't feel comfortable speaking to the group, you can also feel free to use the meeting chat and I'll be monitoring that as well. So let's just dive right in here. So the purpose of today's webinar is to go through Lens. And the big question is probably, what even is Lens? So Lens is, at its most basic, a tool that lets you action your geospatial data in Giraffe. So you can style, filter, and share your data throughout your team. And the goal is really to turn your maps into knowledge and use that data to empower good decisions and clear communication. So with that said, let's just get started with the basics. And I'm going to show you the basics of Lens on a layer that's pretty familiar to most Giraffe users, and that's the 3D buildings layer. This data comes from OpenStreetMaps. You can see here on my screen that we're opened up to Dallas, Texas, and we have this sort of white box 3D buildings layer open. It's from OpenStreetMaps. It's an openly available data set, and it's actually kind of cool. It's similar to like a Wikipedia where folks from around the world can contribute edits and changes and suggestions to that OpenStreetMap. So it's a really widely used data set, and we love including it with all of our Giraffe projects. So I am looking at the data on the map, but I also have that layer listed in my layer tree here to the left. And I can tell that this 3D buildings layer is a vector data set because of the icon that's next to its name. And it's important if you want to use Lens to understand what types of data can be used with Lens. So something like this satellite layer here, this layer I know is not a layer I can use with Lens because it has this sort of classic photo or JPEG icon. That means it's a raster layer. So it's basically just image data, which is not something that we can query or action against. Whereas if I look at my 3D buildings layer here, it has this icon that's a square with little dots in the corners. That is our vector icon. And any layer that has this square with dots in the corners, you can use Lens on. So just be looking out for that. If you do have a layer that's in raster format and you're wondering if it's out there in vector format, feel free to email me and I can help you do some web sleuthing to see if we can find that in the correct format for you. So let's just open up Lens here on our 3D buildings layer. And the way you access Lens is via these three dots here on to the right of the layer name. And I'm just going to click there. And then I have this open lens controls option. Once I open up the lens controls here, it gives me this little toolbar here at the top left. And this toolbar is what allows me to do everything in Lens. So I'm going to start first on this project with just going through some of the style options. And styling here, there's a few different ways that you can style data, and we'll actually go through all the different data types that you can work through with Lens in this demo. So the first one that we're looking at here is 3D, and that's because these buildings are obviously 3D. They have a height. They're taking up volumetric space in your project. So the styling options for 3D here are we can color these buildings by different parameters. We can adjust their fill opacity, which just means how how opaque or transparent they are. And then we can do some funky things with setting the height and the base height of these buildings. I'll show you a better use case for that later. I'm going to leave the 3D buildings as the default base height and height properties that came with this data set. But what I do want to show you is different ways that we can color this data set. So right now I have it colored by height. And you can see that it's giving me sort of a range of different blues depending on how tall that building is. I can view those options here by clicking on, I did that very fast, by clicking on this color range that it gives me. And then I can come in here and do things like change the color palette. Like maybe I want all of the buildings to be purple. I like purple better. And that just adjusts your color palette to be in that range. Additionally, with quantitative ranges, which means generally that it's calculating numbers between 0 and to infinity, depending on the type of data set. So for this, the height property is obviously a number property. So the shorter the building is, the lighter the color purple it's applying. That's a really basic one. One that's much more fun, I think, is to color by the type. And when I do that, now all of my buildings get a specific color applied based on what type of building that is. And that comes from the 3D buildings data set. So someone has gone into the OpenStreetMaps data set and tagged each of these buildings as what kind of building it is. And you can see here, when I open this up, we have all of these options, and I can either, if I don't like those colors, change it to a different set of colors, or I can get really specific and say, like, apartments are really important to me, so I want them to stand out. So I'm going to come in here and make all apartment buildings this bright red, so they really stand out to me on the map. So you have some really nice control there with styling things based on metadata that's in the data set. In my next portion of the demo, I'll actually show you how that, where that data comes from on most vector layers. It's easier to visualize on a different data set than the 3D buildings. So I'm just going to leave the 3D buildings as they are for now. And then just close out of that. So now I have, this very nice colorful map that's actually much easier to read than the default white. I kind of know what my neighboring buildings are and what's going on here. But what I do have actually is a project on this site that I've built. And I've sort of built a basic version of Dallas City Hall here. But what I'm noticing is my 3D buildings layer still has some geometry here. And I don't want that included in my project because I did a much nicer model than what was by default in the 3D buildings layer. So a new thing in Lens now is I can remove that by using a filter. So on my 3D buildings layer, if I go to filter in Lens, I have this geometry option. And the geometry option allows me to draw a boundary around buildings that I want to exclude. And then it will just remove those buildings from my project. I'm just going to draw a big rectangle around here. And you can see as soon as I did that, my building from the 3D buildings layer disappeared. So that gives me some really good control there over what is included or not included. I could also add additional filters and do something like filter by type. And maybe I only want to see my apartments nearby. And I can filter out anything that's not an apartment. So now, I can see all of just my neighboring apartment residential buildings. I'm going to put my apartments back, but I'm going to keep my geometry filter. And then one last thing I want to show you here before I close out of the lens controls is just our settings button here. So when I click settings, there's a few additional options. And a really useful one when you're exploring, especially a large data set, is the show table option. And when my internet catches up, this table will show a list of all of the data that is available in that 3D buildings data set. That's always fun. And it's always the zoom. Like I definitely tested this right before to make sure that this area had some good data to look at in that table. So thanks Zoom for stealing all of my bandwidth. I might actually turn off my video because that will help with bandwidth in the future. We'll check out that table on a future data set as well. It might load faster for another one. The other option under settings is prevent map query, and that just means that it's going to prevent me from clicking on these buildings and doing something that I don't want to be doing. So I find that show table is the most useful here if it's something that I want to look and explore through that large data set. Okay. When I close lens controls, it saves those changes to my lens layer. And now that's part of this project. So if this project, for instance, was a template, and I use this project to create new projects, the styling that I saved to that layer would come along with the template. So if this was the default that you wanted all of your projects to look like, set up your lens filters and styling in your template, and then your team can just use those over and over again. If I do want to come in here and remove these style settings that I've applied, I can tell that this layer has a lens applied because it has this little filter icon on it. So that way I know, this multicolored version is probably not the default that came with that layer straight out of the box. So if I want to get rid of that styling, I can just click on the three dots again and click unapply lens. And that will set it back to the default. So you can see now it's all back to being that default white. If I want those lens settings back, I can just click apply lens again, and it'll bring back whatever my most recently saved version is. You can also jump back in and obviously edit it further by opening up the lens controls again if you wish, but you can just toggle back and forth between those settings that you just saved. Okay, a lot of words. I want to stop for a second and make sure no one has any questions before I go to the next portion of the demo.
I have one question.
Sure.
The templates, you mentioned kind of saving this as a template so that everybody in your group can access it.
Yep.
Can any user create a default template for the team, or do you have to have certain permissions to do that? I think Emily was trying to do that on one of our license and she wasn't able to, but I think I am. How does that work?
You need to be an admin of the workspace to make a template for others to use. You can make a template for yourself. So I could go into the project settings here and click use as template on this project. And if I wasn't an admin of this workspace, I'd have the option to do for me, and then it would just be my personal template. But to share it with your teams or your workspace, you need to be admins of the workspace or the team.
Okay. Is an admin something, like, can we have multiple admins, or is it just one?
Yeah, you can have multiple admins. You can just go into your admin settings here in the menu and just edit her membership to be admin instead of edit.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. Great.
I like how the lenses, you can turn it on and off and it saves whatever you just did. So you can, that's a huge one.
Yes, definitely. And that way you can also compare, like you might have been doing some work on that layer, doing some exploration, but maybe you want to put it back to what the default is real quick and just check against that. So it's easy to switch it on and off.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Great. Well, let's dive into the next portion here, and I'm just going to turn off my project, but I'm going to do a demonstration that is based on a line data set. So if I go into 2D, you'll be able to see this now. All of these black lines that are showing up are a data set from Texas Department of Transportation, and it's all the roadways that they have included in this data set. So right now, looking at this, just being black lines is not very useful to me. Like, sure, I kind of know where they're expecting their road center lines to be, but otherwise it's not telling me anything. So I'm going to go in here and see what I can do with my lens controls on this layer. So I'll just click the 3 dots here, open my lens controls, get rid of all of my previous lenses that were in there. And then I can, again, style this, and you can style it by different means. So I'll actually show you this. By default, this was by a fixed color, and it was just everything's black. But what I want to do is style this outline, which is the lines, by one of these properties within this data set. Now looking here, these properties are kind of cryptic compared to the 3D buildings layer. Like, it was very clear in 3D buildings what each property did, but here I'm not really sure. So what I'm actually going to do is go to the source of this data and take a look at what these layers each contain in that source. So this is the Texas Department of Transportation GIS website. This is their open data website. It's where the layer came from. And it's on their Esri server, which I can tell because it has ArcGIS in the URL. So this kind of website for that data set is really good for exploring the attributes and kind of figuring out what the purpose of those attributes are. So in here, I can see, again, this is the same list that was showing up in my map previously, but now I can kind of drop down here and see what actually are the contents of each of those data sets. So now I can tell based on what I'm looking at here that, oh, this probably means road bed type, because these are different types of roads, basically. Whereas if I look here, roadway stat, I don't know what that means. And then when I open it up here, I can tell, oh, the roadway stat is roadway status. And these are like different telling me basically if there's something that's under construction or open or not built or whatever. So coming in and looking at the actual information of each of those layers before starting to apply lenses can be very helpful. So now that I know this, I think I want to color my my map by roadbed type. And I might do some filters and just see if there's anything that's under construction, do a little exploration with this lens. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to find that roadbed type. Now it's coloring my roads by those different attributes that are within the layer. I can also change the width of these lines to make them a little bit more significant on my map. So here I have the choice between pixels, which means they're going to be the same width no matter how far in or out I've zoomed, or I can do it in meters and set like an exact width and make it, you know, always the size based on the actual map instead of on my computer scaling. I'm going to bring these back down to 3 in pixels. And then here I want to do a little bit of exploration and just see which of these roads might be closed currently. So I'm going to bring up that roadway status. And I'm going to say, well, it looks like none of these are closed because it's not bringing up that option. That's a good one to notice in in Lens is the options that show up in your dropdown are dynamic based on what's actually visual on your map. So I can select open to traffic. Looks like everything's open to traffic. And the reason I'm not seeing this, open with construction or under construction options is because those items aren't visible in my current map view. Any questions with styling line-based data? Oh, I see Alex asked a question. Oh, just sending me, Alex likes the idea of going to the source to know what each attribute means. Yeah, it's a really helpful way to sort of, be a little bit more efficient instead of just doing the click explore, which, we all do it sometimes, but if you want to be a little more scientific, you can go back to that source. Great. Well, if we have no more questions about line-based data, I'll go to my next one, which is point-based data. So I'm just going to turn those off, turn on my points. Make sure I am zoomed in enough for this to show up. Oh, unapply lens. Has my old lens on it. There we go. Now we've got, you can see there's some dots that are starting to show up. This point-based data set is all of the building permits that were granted in Dallas in, I think it's like 2021 was when this specific data set was created. This one is a point in time data set. It was from a shape file that I manually uploaded. They didn't have an API available for this one, unfortunately. So this is from a specific year, just sort of looking back in history and seeing what's happening. But with point-based data, it's literally just dots that are going to be on your map. But each of those dots in this case is a permit that was granted for something. So, just seeing these colors, which are also very light by default, and the dots are very small by default, it's kind of hard to explore what's actually going on here. So again, I'm going to open up my lens controls and do a little work. So I will open up style first, and this is circle because they're point based. And I might want to color these based on probably the type of item. Which do I remember which property that is? So here we're gonna watch me do some just clicking around to see what. I think it's nope, not ID. Activity. There we go. So the activity here is telling me what kind of permit is happening here. So alterations, reconstruction, renovation, new construction. So now I can go here and see, for instance, like this area has a ton of blue dots. So there's a lot of new construction happening right there. So it's a good way to kind of explore, especially if you have a really up-to-date or even API connected data set of permits, is to see where like hotspots are for development. So I like doing that. Another thing I'll want to do with these circles is just make them a little bit bigger. They're kind of small. It's kind of hard to see. So I'll just up that radius a bit. And then what also might be helpful is, I'm not actually interested in renovations or alterations or whatever. Like those are not important to me in this exploration. So I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to filter out activity, and I'm going to filter out to is not, and then just select ones that I don't want to see. So I don't care about renovations. I don't care about alterations. I don't care about finish outs. I just want to see something where something new is really being built here. So that's just taken out a few of those extraneous dots that are not that helpful for me. And then what I can also do here is add labels to these dots. So I'll just turn on my labels here, and then I can add labels from any of these properties that are included in here. So, you know, having what the activity is could be useful, but it's also interesting to see, you know, what the job value is, when that item was issued. And then you can see all of that information start to generate on each of these dots. And then this one, let's see if my table renders. Yeah, there we go. Now we can look at the table. So here is really helpful because I can now just explore this whole data set as a, you know, table view, very typical. But if I go in here and click on one of these, let's see if I can click on a dot. It's going to select that dot and then give me information about that dot that I selected. It looks like this data set, you know, there's two right next to each other. So because of how far out I was, I clicked on two at once, basically. But because I clicked there, now I can explore, okay, for Prescott Ave, we've got a couple of reconstruction items going on. Their job value is, you know, that amount, etc. So I can start exploring in this table view and also in my selected features here, going into details about each of those items. I can see then for, let's see. I can also select everything at once to view all of it at once over here in the side. That's not always that useful unless it's a small data set, but that is an option. And then you can also filter this if I have just a couple of items selected like before, I can tell my table to only show me the selected rows, and then it jumps right to those items. So I can also view those in the table. Any questions about point-based data? I see Jess asked a question in the chat. Can you make the circle size square by circle sizes scale by amounts? Not yet. It's on the roadmap.
Cool.
Yep. Okay, so I will move to my next data type. And whoops, I got to close out of this so that it goes away. And this one I find to be a very typical use case that's very useful for a lot of folks. So we're going to take a look at the regrid data set. This is an additional add-on data set for your workspace if you don't have it already, or if you subscribe to regrid outside of Giraffe, we can probably work something out with your account rep there to bring that data into your Giraffe workspace as well. But here we're looking at all of the parcels. Regrid is pretty good coverage. It's parcels for almost the entire United States. And then it has zoning data also where available in a lot of those municipalities as well. Generally larger, more populous areas, it's more likely to have the zoning data. But what we can use the regrid data set for is to really do some like prospecting here. So if I open up my lens controls, first of all, I'm going to want to style my outlines by something that makes more sense to me than what the default is. This data set is very dense, so we'll just give it a second to load. Coloring by my use description is probably going to be actually useful for me. No, there we go. Okay, cool. So we've got in Dallas specifically, we've got some very high level use descriptions. So basically just commercial, residential, or BPP. Great, that's fine for this demo. But you can, it really depends on where you are on the map, what is available in each of those different fields, because it's kind of controlled by what that municipality provides. So we'll just use that as a starting point. I could add labels to this. There's so many parcels on the screen that it would take a long time to load, so I'm just going to leave it as is. But you can see that I have an outline applied. So each of those parcels does have an outline that's visible, and I can, just like on the roads, I can style that stroke width if I wish. But what I think is more interesting here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that it loads a little bit faster. My internet will catch up with me. There we go. Okay. So too far. So I'm going to start filtering these parcels based on criteria that's going to be important to me. So one thing that would be really important if you're a land developer is how many acres the site is. Like maybe you don't want to develop something if the site isn't big enough. So I can select this GIS acres and put in is greater than, and then I can put in a value like 5. So what this is going to do is then drop out any parcels on the map that aren't at least 5 acres in size. And then I can go even further. Maybe I want only parcels that currently have the use description of residential. That's going to drop out everything that's not residential. And then Regrid also has other information that's really useful, like the parcel value, the year it's built, the owner even. So you can do searches that are very granular using this Regrid data set and really get it down to a selection of parcels that might be interesting to you. And then what you can do is click on these, and occasionally the Regrid data set has a million shapes on top of each other. So you end up with this kind of information where it's very stacked. Trying to find one that's not so bad, but I guess in this case, they've just got so many stacked on top of each other. These might actually be multiple parcels, or they were at some point, or I don't know what the situation is with those. But I can now open this up and see additional information. It's a developed site. It's got that residential use description. It's zoned for condominiums, the owner name, the parcel number. So all of this information is really useful when you're prospecting for potential sites, to have all of that in your back pocket to be able to put into your reports and use it for your further research and your next steps. Since I really like this parcel in particular, it's going to let me click it. What I can do is actually use that shape to action the data. So I can do this and add to a new project. And it's going to create me a whole new project out of that parcel outline right from this exploration in Lens. And I can do this with anything. Like, it does not have to be a parcel-based data set. It could be any shape-based data set. So you could be looking at all of the parks in a municipality. You could be looking at just major zoning overlays, and maybe you're doing a zoning exploration and you want to create a project of everything from this specific overlay. So you can use it in a variety of ways, and it's very useful that way. Any questions about that prospecting use case before I go to the next one?
Nope.
Nope. Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm going to then turn off my regrid data set. And bring up my final example for today. So I have this data set that is age and gender demographics from the 2010 census. Right now I have it turned on and it's just teal. Like that's not very useful to me. I have no idea what's happening here. So obviously, since I can see that this is a vector data set, I want to do some work to do some additional styling. So I'm going to open up my lens controls and it remembers my styling from last time. So I'll just nuke that out. What I want to do here is, first of all, I can just go to fill and start coloring my different shapes by different attributes in this data set. One that's really interesting to me is the population density. I really like visualizing that. So now I have each of these shapes colored by the population density of that area. If I open this up, I can adjust further to be like, you know, maybe I want this to go from blue to purple. Maybe I can adjust the distances between these items a little bit just to, you know, maybe I want one that's super dark for very dense areas. Yeah. I want this to be, there we go. Gonna make this the highest amount. And then when I update this, now my colors on the map have updated as well. If I pop into 3D view here, you know, it's interesting, but it's really just showing me again shapes on a map. It's not really communicating anything that well. But what I can do is this other 3D format that I was hinting at earlier in the demo, and I can actually set my height to be a property from the data set as well. So I'm going to set my height to be based on the population density too. And then as I zoom out here, you can see that you get this really nice visualization, if I don't zoom out too far, of the population density for a region. And these are really great for presentations. They're, you know, it looks really cool and it really communicates the story that, you know, down here towards the center is really where it's the most dense in population. And you can do this with any vector data set that has numbers. So you could style it by parcel value and have, you know, the parcels that are the most expensive will have the greatest height. You could style it by number of school kids who have graduated from high school in that region. Like you can really start doing some interesting geospatial visualizations for presentations using that that functionality. And with that, that was everything I wanted to show you all today in Lens. So, you know, before we close out, I just want to make sure that anyone who's here on the call today has a chance to ask any questions or comments. Feel free to unmute or use the meeting chat, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Hi, Holly. It's Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, I had to join late. Is there anywhere I can watch the recording from the beginning?
Yeah, we'll post it to YouTube shortly.
Oh, right. Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Looks great.
Yep. Thanks.
Holly, I have a question. Me and Emily have been working with these a little bit this week and styling, and we had pins, like a point data, and then we had the a demographic layer similar to this. And we wanted the points to show up on top of the demographic layer, but the demographic layer was always on top, no matter how we oriented it on the layers panel to the left. Does demographic and styled layers, do those always show up on top? Or I guess, how does the layering system work?
It should render in the order that it appears in this palette. So for instance, my roadways should render on top. However, because these are actually 3D, it might be because the height of it is taller than where the point is located. The point ends up getting buried inside of the 3D information. So you might just have to make it a little bit transparent.
Okay. So,
And
so I
then
guess we could
go ahead.
raise the base layer of our points too, I guess.
Yes. Yep. And I'd be happy to, get on a follow-up call with you and troubleshoot through that if you need.
Awesome.
All right. Well, it seems like we don't have any other questions. So thanks everyone for joining today. You'll get an email shortly also with the link to the YouTube once it's all uploaded and ready to go. And if you have any questions about Lens or anything else at all, feel free to email me directly at holly@giraffe.build, or you can use the question mark icon in the bottom right of your Giraffe window and just use get in touch, and that chat will take you right to someone on the Giraffe team. Great. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thanks for joining me for Feature Friday, and I'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Ollie.
Thanks, Holly. Thank you.